Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. In this episode, I'll be talking to Sarah King and Richard Gunn from the EPSRC, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council in the UK. But before we go into the interview, here's a bit of background, particularly if you're from outside the UK. Getting research software engineering recognised as a role is one thing, but getting it funded quite another. Obviously, that's quite important if you want to establish research software engineering as roles and careers. But how you go about it in your area and country depends on many different factors, like, for instance, how funding is structured, who the key organizations are that can help setting it up, and, of course, how you can convince them in funding research software engineering in the first place. In the United Kingdom, the UK Research and Innovation Organisation plays an important role in funding research. The UKRI, as it's called, is a non-governmental body which is sponsored by the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The UK maintains 9 councils covering different sectors. 2 of these councils have played a pivotal role in funding research software engineering in the UK. The Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, in short EPSRC, and the Science and Technology Facilities Council, or STFC. Here now my conversation with Sarah King and Richard Gunn. Hello Richard and Sarah, and welcome to the show. Could you briefly introduce yourself to the audience before we start?
My name's Sarah King. I'm a portfolio manager in the infrastructure theme at EPSRC, with responsibility for things like collaborative computational projects and research software engineers.
Hello, I'm Richard Gunn. I'm head of EPSRC's e-infrastructure programme. So that means that our team is responsible for both what you might call the hard and soft digital infrastructures that engineering and physical sciences researchers rely upon. So typically national scale computing and data services, but also research software, and perhaps most importantly, the skills, knowledge transfer and career pathways of digital infrastructure professionals.
Excellent, thank you very much. Before we go into talking a little bit about research software engineering in particular, many people, particularly those listening to from outside the UK, may not actually know what EPSRC is and which organisation it's embedded in, which is UKRI. Could one of you maybe briefly explain what the organisation is, what it does, and where it sits?
So EPSRC is the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and we are part of UK Research and Innovation. So we are the UK's national agency for funding engineering and physical sciences research and postgraduate training.
Thanks very much for that. The concept of a research software engineer is actually quite new, and it developed sometime, as a role, it developed sometime in the last decade. And I understand that the fellowship funded by the UKRI, EPSRC, was a pivotal moment to promote and grow the research software engineering as a role. And I'd be quite interested to hear how this came about.
Yeah, basically, EPSRC has long recognised the importance of investing in software and development. And for a number of years now, we've had a software as an infrastructure strategy. Previous funding, we've always focused on things like support for development of key software codes that our EPS community use in their research. But this strategy, this new software as an infrastructure strategy, actually recognised that skills and career development for those who are working in software engineering actually needed funding as well. At about the same time, we also started to fund the organisation, the Software Sustainability Institute. The work that they ran workshops and seminars, and that raised the profile even further that we needed to do something in this area. They created an RSE movement and established the UK RSE Association. The aim of it was to further increase the access to software development skills for the UK researchers. At about this point, within EPSRC, the theme lead at the time, Dr. Susan Morell, and her team came up with this pilot plan to launch an RSE Fellowships call. That was held in 2015, and the aim of that was to raise awareness for the RSE role, improve the career paths for RSEs, and also very much raise the recognition and reward for RSEs within institutions. That call it attracted a large number of applications, and seven fellowships were awarded at the end of it. Those fellowships were 5 years in length, and they are looking to end at some point next year. A couple of years later, the demand was so high for the first pilot, and because of the success of it, we ran a second call. I think it was in 2017, and we've awarded a further 4 fellowships out of that.
Well, I'd really encourage listeners to take a look at the Software Sustainability Institute's website to kind of get the full story on this. And it's fascinating going through the original email exchanges. There was a blog post from 2016 on the history of all of this. And it all started in 2012 when a former colleague of mine, Dan Emerson, attended an SSI workshop. And I think the session that really kicked this all off was realizing that software developers lack something a bit more fundamental than just recognition. They didn't have a name or a brand. So at least according to the SSI's version of history, this was the birth of the term RSE. And that really gathered momentum through a series of workshops. So EPSRC, I think, has kind of really been there since the start. And that led to the first round of the RSE Fellowship Scheme in 2015, as Sarah described. So I just want to note the contribution of both kind of Dan Emerson, who's sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but also Susan Morrell, Louise Tillman, Ian Lamore, and Eddie Clark, colleagues of mine in EPSRC.
So you mentioned the Software Sustainability Institute as an organization you worked with to set up this fellowship and promote the role of research software engineering. Are there any other organizations you worked with at the time to make this happen?
So when we put plans together for new initiatives, we work typically very closely with our community. And in research infrastructure, we tend to think of the community as actually communities. So the community that develops research infrastructures, but also the community of users of research infrastructures. So in the engineering and physical sciences world, obviously there's a broad range of users across engineering, physics, chemistry, manufacturing, and other fields. The key body that we work with routinely on when we're developing activities is our strategic advisory team, or SAT. They're our kind of go-to, if you like, advisory group taken from all those different strands of the community, and you can find details of that on the EPSRC website. One key challenge that we had is that fellowships have traditionally always been anchored within the activities of specific research programs. Yeah. So I think it was a very bold step by my predecessors to actually kind of put a flag in the sand and say that as an infrastructure program, we'll spend some of our annual funding on a fellowship program.
Yeah, how much arm twisting was actually involved to get the budget to finance the fellowship? Because the fellowship is still ongoing. I believe there's a call for a new fellowship next year. How hard was it to actually get the budget for that?
From my point of view, in terms of sort of like getting the budget, I think it was the one activity that the community identified as being the most important ones to run in terms of our following on activities. So I think in that respect, that was the one that came to the top of the pile in terms of funding. And Richard had the budget, and we had the backing to do it.
Research software engineering is a role, definitely, and there are a number of vacancies and roles throughout the UK in universities, and not only in the UK, in other countries now as well. In a number of countries, it's a growing movement. But is it actually a discipline in the sense like, for instance, a physicist or doing physics is a discipline?
From my perspective, I'm not sure that I do see it as a discipline in its own right. What are research software engineers? Why they're unique in that they have a combination of professional software engineering expertise, but that's combined with an intimate understanding of research in whichever area, to a certain extent, they're working on.
So I think there's certainly a distinctive skill set required to be a research software engineer, and I would define that as a deep expertise in software development coupled with an understanding of the research environment and the cultures of different research disciplines. So I think there's a very distinctive blend of those kind of deep technical skills and actually quite a broad sense of curiosity, really, that RSEs have. Whether that makes research software engineering a discipline or not, I'm not sure, but it's definitely distinctive.
So we talked a little bit about the fellowship, and the fellowship, the remit of that is for engineers to propose to work on projects that fall within the EPSRC scientific areas. But as we all know, computing now plays an important part of research across the field, including, for instance, humanities such as linguistics. Would that be covered as well? So if I were working in the linguistics, say, and I would like to apply for a fellowship at EPSRC, would that actually fail because I'm not in the right slot, so to speak?
Certainly with the previous calls that we've run, they have been completely funded by EPSRC. The call that is open at the moment is slightly different in the STFC, which is the Science and Technologies Facilities Council. They have joined the call this time. Yeah, unfortunately, because the funding is coming from those two councils, we would not be able to accept applications from applicants who are doing research in other remits.
I think that sometimes the work that we do as research software engineers is kind of, I wouldn't say falling through the cracks, but it's kind of sitting in between disciplines. Some people might argue the same happens with the fellowship, where there's the councils have a definition, a well-defined role and remit of what a fellowship is for. But what if I happen to do a research project or a fellowship program that actually doesn't really entirely sit there with one council or the other? Do you think that there is in future a way that you could widen the remit of the fellowship?
I think this is something that we should aspire to do. Certainly from the applications we received in this last call that I've been involved in, there is significant demand for RSEs across other councils' remits. And it is also probably true to say as well that much of the software that is developed within these fellowships would actually have applications in the research associated with other councils. I think work is ongoing, within UKRI to look at widening the opportunities for RSEs. And I think personally, I think it would be good to have a UKRI-wide fellowship programme.
Richard?
Bringing together the research councils as UK Research and Innovation gives us a real opportunity, I think, to develop the RSE model across all of our communities. And when I talk to my colleagues in other councils, there's a real enthusiasm to make this happen in the future. However, I don't think this is just about rolling out the RSE scheme to other councils. It's really about ensuring that the entire concept of fellowship funding is inclusive to research technical professionals, including research software engineers. Within EPSRC, we've recently taken steps to explicitly articulate this in our standard open fellowship scheme and encourage applications from RSEs and RTPs. So I think this goes beyond the specifics of the Research Software Engineering Fellowship call and about how we think of fellowship funding in general.
So we talked so much about the fellowship now, and there is a new round currently in progress. Can you tell us a little bit more about the next round of fellowship, which I think will start next year?
The round that is open, the round 3 of the fellowships, which is open at the moment, is the fellowships that it is being funded by EPSRC and STFC. It's very similar to the rounds that we've done before in terms of what we're asking in terms of the aims and objectives, but there is slightly more focus on the RSE fellows establishing the role within their host institutions and beyond to a certain extent. We have RSE groups that have grown up around the country who are also improving access to software development to researchers. But one of the things that we do see that we need to work on as well is establishing within institutions themselves a more stable career path for RSEs. That is one of the issues that we're trying to address.
It's actually quite a nice segue into the discussion that I would like to have next, which is in fact the future of RSEs and the future of the fellowship, because a few years ago, I think there was a pivotal moment in 2016 with a conference in Manchester, I believe, that gave a lot of momentum to the RSE movement. But now that a number of universities in the UK and in other countries have established groups, where do you see the future actually going? Where do you see the future of RSEs in these universities going? And in particular then, as a next question, where do you see the fellowship going? Is there going to be another round after this one? Richard, maybe I'll start with you.
Perhaps if we take a step back, I mean, I can only see the importance of high quality research software engineering becoming more and more prominent, and that's prominent both within institutions and funders. Obviously, the pandemic this year has kind of brought this into sharp focus. So RSE skills, I think, will increasingly act as a distinguishing feature for institutions and research communities, both nationally and internationally. I think we're also at a fairly pivotal point in terms of the next generation of technologies. So we see the scale of these initiatives continuing to increase. And certainly as we move towards the exascale, that's going to become, these are going to have to become probably much larger initiatives and more structured initiatives. So UKRI and the Met Office launched the Excalibur programme in 2019 to redesign high priority simulation codes and algorithms in preparation for exascale computing. And the entire Excalibur programme is really, I suppose, centred on RSEs as being at the heart of that activity. So I think those are the kind of approaches we can expect to see in the future.
In terms of sort of like where the RSE movement and RSE fellows are going, there can only be an increase in demand for their skills. As Richard says, as we move towards the new exascale architecture, researchers are having access to vast quantities of data, that they need help and they need the skills of a high quality RSE to enable them to analyze all that data. Yeah, I see RSEs being very much in demand.
So there is the demand of RSEs, but changing the career path in university is quite an undertaking because, very often the career path in the educational sector is very fixed. How do you work with the universities to actually open up more career opportunities for research software engineers? What do you think that EPSRC and you can do to help that make happen?
I think that is our challenge. Our role is, as a funder, is also to influence as well. And I know from the conversations that we've had that some institutions and research offices have embraced the RSE role. And I think what we need to do as a funder is possibly use the best practices of those institutions to influence those who are not as far forward, shall we say.
So there's also the question, I believe, that you mentioned that there are a number of universities in London, Imperial College, for instance, or UCL, where I am at, and other groups like Manchester has a very large group of RSEs. But there might be smaller universities and research labs where the funding might be a little bit tighter. They're smaller, they have a limited budget. How can they be helped?
So I think this is a challenge for the whole community. I think what's important from a funder perspective is, some of the work that we've been doing and progressing that in terms of making very clear, I think, to both the potential applicants, the university management, and also the reviewers of proposals that actually we really encourage and value the contribution of RSEs and RTPs and not create these kind of artificial distinctions between people that are maybe on a more traditional academic track and those that perhaps come from more of a research technical professional type culture and background.
Moving away a little bit from the role definition, you mentioned exascale and Excalibur. Why do you think it is so important, and what is your role in supporting that?
It's the next generation of computer hardware. It's been embraced by in other international organisations. The USA, Japan, and China are all well on their way to producing their own exascale machines. It is where the future of computing, to a certain that and quantum technology as well. It is the future of computing, and as such, if the UK wants to remain a sort of like a contributor to the global knowledge base, then we need to embrace that as well.
I think the potential of exascale computing is really exciting, and I think the difference perhaps from what you're seeing in the way the Excalibur programme is structured compared to the way we've traditionally thought of these things as research councils is that we're really taking a UKRI-centric view on that. So the opportunities aren't just for perhaps what you might call the pioneer communities, so the traditional users of high-performance computing that will inevitably be, I suppose, the kind of at the forefront of the development of these technologies, but also thinking about the opportunities for the biosciences, for medicine, for the humanities, for the social sciences. And what we're doing through Excalibur is trying to design that from the bottom up rather than kind of the more iterative approach that I think we've developed all the way through to the petascale. Because actually, when you look at the kind of scale and potential of these systems, and actually frankly the amount of money they're going to cost to run, we have to take a kind of sensible community-based decision. We can't go off in different directions on this and have a large fragmentation of the code base. And that's where the RSEs really do sit at the centre, I think, of these initiatives. Because I'll come back to the point about the kind of the marriage of deep technical skills and curiosity. I think that's what we need to kind of be ready for exascale in a few years' time.
And I think it's also quite important that you highlight the community aspect of it, because I think holding that together and working as one, as you said, is having a more success than if we go off a tangent and sort of everybody does their own thing. I'd like to move a little bit away from that onto a different subject. There's a recent initiative called Hidden Ref, and the reason I mention that is that it tries to address scientific output that hasn't been recognized yet. In the context of research software engineering, do you think that software falls into that category, an aspect of research that is not recognized or underrepresented?
I would agree that software is not well recognised, certainly within the research excellence framework, the REF. And you just have to look at the statistics for the 2014 REF, in that publications basically form the bulk of the outputs that are submitted to it. The reasoning behind this is because publications are well understood in academia, and partly the problem is that not every contributor to research outputs and research outcomes is actually included in these publications. And that is actually in spite of the fact that the REF guidelines do actually include a category for software. I think the reason that the software doesn't get included so often is because that at institutions, funding is very much reliant on the results that come out of the REF. And because institutions are risk averse, they tend to submit to the REF the standard things such as publications. And I think up until now, research software has not received the recognition it deserves in terms of its contribution to research outcomes. The Hidden Ref came about, and it aims to basically fundamentally challenge sort of like the preconceptions about the roles, which roles are important within research, and it looks to celebrate all the research outputs and recognise all of those who have contributed to those research outputs.
Richard?
I think that conceptually, at least, the role of research software is becoming increasingly well recognised because of initiatives like the Hidden Ref research community, but also in terms of the general public. And I think it's been interesting, given the role of modelling and simulation in our response to COVID-19 and how that has become front page news. However, I think the challenge for us collectively as a research community is still in systematically quantifying the contribution of research software and ensuring that research software practitioners are given suitable recognition for their contribution, including career structures and recognition within institutions, as we've talked about today. I think there are good reasons to be optimistic that we're making progress, but somehow we need to make the jump between the conceptual recognition of the role of software in research and the systematic way of capturing that and aligning it to career incentives in institutions.
Is the EPSRC or UKRI actually involved in that initiative, Hidden Ref?
I don't think we're involved directly, but we do work with a number of the supporters of the Hidden Ref, namely the Software Sustainability Institute and the Society of Research Software Engineers. UKRI are also a signatory to the Technicians Commitment, which is also a supporter of the Hidden Ref. One thing I would like to just mention is, in addition to supporting the REF, the Software Sustainability Institute are also working with the traditional REF subpanel 11, which looks at computer science and informatics, and they have worked with them to produce and agree a a set of guidelines for submitting software as a research output to the REF in 2021. So it's kind of a pincer movement. They're supporting the hidden REF, but they're also using their influence as well on the traditional REF to try and achieve, a recognition.
Excellent. We mentioned COVID-19. How does that influence your work? Has coronavirus made it harder? Or has it maybe even accelerated some of the progress? What's your take on that?
I think one of the interesting things that has resulted from the situation we've been in with the pandemic has been that it has made us perhaps question some of the assumptions behind the way we structure funding for research. If you look at kind of the progress that has been made in terms of kind of scientific research into COVID-19, I think the role of sort of preprint and publication of this kind of very iterative sort of open science approach has been really important. I think in terms of sort of from a funder perspective, we've been able to act in a very agile way to support important and urgent COVID-19 research. So through our Archer high-end computing consortia, we've managed to prioritise resources for COVID work and gone from an initial conversation with the consortia involved to actually running experiments in about a week, as opposed to the usual, months that it would take for peer-reviewed activities. And I think the only reason we could do that is because we have these pre-existing partnerships with our community. So actually that kind of trusted relationship, if you like, where we have groups where we're confident that they can work with the community and develop proportionate and rigorous peer review activities that can happen quite quickly. That's been really important during the pandemic. And then, of course, there's the perhaps more practical matter of being able to use digital technologies remotely, which has been really important as well.
Sarah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I can add is the strength of the communities that we work with and we support, and the speed at which they were able to come together, as Richard said, to get things off the ground, to get access to sort of like computing facilities. That sort of like has been in some respects the strength that we've been able to deploy. And again, in terms of being able to work remotely, it was incredible that within sort of like a few days we were all up and running at home. And we've been able to keep the funding. There have been delays, it's unavoidable with personnel on both sides, on the academics front and on EPS, on the Research Council's front, working and supporting childcare as well. We have been able to keep functioning pretty much on a full-time basis.
Yeah, no, it's quite amazing. And I think we should pat ourselves on the shoulders that we actually managed to keep the lights on, so to speak, so very quickly. We're coming to the end of the podcast now, and there's one question that, actually two. The fellowship for next year, how many fellowships are going to be open?
We have a target of between 4 and 8 for the EPSRC fellowships, and there is one STFC fellowship. We will be unable until it comes to the sort of like the final stages to be able to determine exactly how many we will be able to award in March next year.
For those who apply and for those who eventually will become fellows, what kind of advice would you give them?
So that's a really interesting question. So I think I would say that the EPSRC fellowship gives them, I'd like to think, a unique opportunity and platform to explore and develop their own distinctive vision for the field, both through the resources that the fellowship gives them and the wider network that they become part of.
My advice would be, in addition to sort of like their research areas, software that they're developing and things like that, not to lose focus of the power of their ambassadorial and outreach influence that they can have, because certainly looking and talking to the current fellows, they have quite an influence within their own communities and wider, sort of like nationally and internationally, and to make the most of that opportunity.
Thank you so much, Richard and Sarah, for your time. It's a fascinating interview, and thank you so much for all the work that you do to support the RSE community.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Peter.